In this lesson, which is part 2, a continuation of the last one, you'll actually use Jest to test one of the Express endpoints. Now, there are 2 ways we could get this done. One would be to actually start up the Express server on port 3000. We would then use an HTTP request library, like the one we used with the weather application, to make real requests to our API from code. Then we could make assertions about the response, seeing if it's correct or not. Well, the Express team, they actually released their own library that makes this even easier to do. It's called SuperTest, and we're going to go ahead and check it out in the browser, install it, and then use it. So over in the browser, I got a bunch of tabs open. I'll go ahead and close a few. I'm going to close SendGrid, my production database, for the moment. And over here in the new tab, what I'm going to do is Google the following: npm SuperTest. So the package we're looking for, SuperTest, should be the first result. And once again, this is a very popular library for testing, especially when it comes to testing Express applications. Now, before we install this, down below in the documentation, I want to pull up a single example so we can wrap our heads around what exactly we're trying to do. So here is an entire example creating an Express application and making a request to it, asserting something about the response. So what do? We load in both SuperTest and Express, and then we define an Express application and set up a single route, something we've already done. So this is the stuff we already have in place. We're not going to need to recreate this. What we are going to do, though, is use the SuperTest library loaded in up above to make a request to the endpoint. So we pass the Express application into request, then we chain on various methods to fire off the request, attach images, send JSON, and assert things about the response. And we'll learn more about exactly how we can use it once we start to use it. So for now, one key thing you'll notice is that a call to app.listen is nowhere, but this still works. SuperTest doesn't need your server to actually be up and running. All it needs is the Express application itself, even if it's not up and running, and it can use that to fire off any of the requests that you're trying to test. So this is going to be excellent for us when we're testing from Jest. Now that we can see what we're getting ourselves into, let's go ahead and actually install this in our project and use it to make a request to one of our endpoints. So over in package.json, I'll be shutting down the test command, and I'll use npm I to install SuperTest at the latest version, which is 3.4.1, and we're going to save this as a dev dependency using save dev. It's only something we're going to need on our local setup when we're running our test command. Now, once we have that installed, we're actually going to be able to use it in our test file. So right here, it did get installed correctly. I'm going to go ahead and rerun npm test. And then we can actually take a moment to close down a few files we'll no longer need. Package.json is all set up. So is test.env and dev.env. Now in here, what do? We have our math.js file and our math.test.js file. We're not going to use these for now, but I will leave them in place just so we can remember exactly how we did certain things. Though now we're going to focus on actually testing the Task Manager app, so I'll create a more appropriately named test suite alongside of the existing one. Over here in the tests directory, I'm going to create one called user.test.js for testing the user-related functionality for our Task Manager app. Now, the first thing we need to do is load in SuperTest, so we'll start there. Const request equals whatever comes back from requiring SuperTest. Now, you'll notice that these don't match up, and once again, this is just the convention that SuperTest uses. You could call this whatever you wanted, including something like SuperTest, but we'll go ahead and stick with the variable name that they usually use. The next thing we need to do is get access to our Express application, but we don't want listen to be called. We just want the Express application before listen is called. Now, for the moment, that's a problem, because the express application is defined in this file, we create it right here, and then listen is called down below. So what we're going to do is perform a little bit of refactoring, just restructuring things across two files so we can get the express application without necessarily actually calling listen. To do that, all we're going to do is create a separate file in the source directory, so a new file sitting right next to index.js, and I'm going to call this app.js. This is where the express application will get set up and exported, then our test suite can load it in, and index.js will also be able to load it in just so it can call listen. Let's go ahead and see what this is going to look like, as it'll be easier to understand once it's done. To start, we're going to take everything in index.js and copy it over to app.js. Now, the only thing we don't want to do in app.js is call listen, so we'll remove it. From there, we'll go ahead and export the application. So module, right here, .exports, and we're going to set that equal to app. Now, since we're no longer calling listen, we're no longer using the port, and we could go ahead and remove that as well. You could leave it in place, but it's a bit unnecessary. So this file sets up the express application and exports the app. Now, we still want index.js to work as expected, but we don't want to have the same code in multiple places. These files are basically duplicates. So what are we going to do? All we're going to do is start this file off up top by loading in the express application from app.js. So right here, const app equals, I'm going to require the file we just created, that is ./app, and now we can remove almost everything in this file. We can remove all of our require calls. We can remove the line where we create the express application and where we configure it. All we're going to leave in place are these three things. We load in the express app, we define our port, and then we call listen. So when I want to start the server up in development mode, what do? I still just run index.js. It takes care of everything. When I want to load in the express application strictly for testing purposes, I just grab it from app.js, and this is exactly what we wanted to do. So we haven't changed the functionality at all. We've just done a little restructuring, allowing us to access that express application without necessarily calling app.listen. Although, when we need to, right here, we still do. Now, over in the test file, we can grab the app so we can use it with supertest. Const app equals. I'm going to use require with the following path. ... to get out of the tests directory, /source/app, the file that we just defined. Now, with this in place, we'll actually be able to make requests to our express application from our test cases, and that is exactly what we're about to do. Right here, I'm going to create the test case by calling that test function and providing a name for it. I'll use something like should sign up a new user, and this test case, as the name suggests, is going to attempt to sign up a new user using post/users. Now I am going to mark this function as an async function, as I'll be taking advantage of await down below. Now we're actually going to start by using await with supertest, as supertest supports promises. Using await will make sure that the request actually finishes before Jest figures out if it's a success or a failure. Now how exactly do we use supertest? Well, we call the function we're provided request, and we pass to it our express application. So I'm going to call it passing in app. Now, the next thing we do is specify exactly what we're trying to request. We have to provide the HTTP method and the URL, and we do that by using a series of methods very similar to those we used when actually creating the express application. So right here, we could access get, patch, delete, or post to make one of those requests. In this case, I want to use post, but we'll explore the others later. And we provide to it the URL. Now, it's not the complete URL, just the path, so /users is exactly what we had configured when defining our express application. Now from here, we want to figure out how we can send data across the wire. I want to provide real, valid data, and I want to expect that the user gets created and I get my 201 status code back. To do that, we chain on a method send. Send allows us to provide an object containing our data, so on here we'll set up name, email, and password. First up, let's configure the name. I'll go ahead and set it equal to Andrew. Then down below that, we'll go ahead and configure the email, andrew@example.com. And finally, we'll set up a password, and in this case, we want all of the data to be valid. We'll set up other test cases later with invalid data to make sure it fails. For now though, we want this one to pass, so I'll use something like my password 777 with an exclamation mark on the end. Now from here, we haven't made any assertions. We've just sent things off to the endpoint. We'll learn how to assert things about the response body a bit later. To start, let's just assert something about the HTTP status code. To do that, we add on another method call to supertest, that is expect. We pass to expect a number, and in this case, we're expecting a 201 if things go well. Now at this point, I want to take things nice and slow because there's a specific problem with our setup that won't be obvious at first. So at first, all we're going to do is save the file. It's going to rerun all of our tests, and we're going to see 2 passing test suites with 7 passing tests. So this is fantastic. It means that obviously our math tests are still working, but it also means that our setup is correct. We were able to load in just the Express application, pass it to supertest, make a request with this data to the following endpoint, and we got a 201 back. Now we actually have data in that test database as well. So if I head over to my MongoDB Compass application, we can switch between the production database and the localhost database. We'll be connecting to that localhost database, and now we have a Task Manager API test database alongside of our original one. So this is the database that contains our test data, and if I crack that open, we have the one user created by our test cases. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that if I rerun the test suite by either saving the file or just using A from jest down below, this test case is gonna fail. And it's failing because there's already a user with that email in the database, and this is gonna be a problem for us. So when I mentioned earlier that we wanna have separate databases for development and test, this is what I'm starting to talk about. When our test cases run, we need to make sure they're starting from a nice, clean slate. So I actually want to wipe all of the data in the test database before the test cases execute to make sure they can run consistently over time. So it's up to us to set up a little bit of code to tell Jest that it should be wiping data and setting up specific data before the test cases run. Our test cases shouldn't work once and then fail the second time because of what the previous run of the test case did to the database. That's going to create a test suite that's useless. Every time our test suite runs, the environment should be recreated, and in our case, that's as simple as deleting everything in the database. And as mentioned, we'll also be setting up data in the database to start with later, so we can test things like the ability to log in or update a profile. So let's go ahead and see what all of this is going to look like. It'll make a lot more sense once we actually have it in place, and that's coming up in the next lesson. For now though, we have a great start. We do have a test case that is successfully able to interact with our Express application and make an assertion about the response. We'll talk about those lifecycle functions that Jest provides in the next lesson, so let's jump right in.